NNNNNNOOOOORSCA. These savage Northmen are hell-bent on the destruction of their enemies in the name of their beloved Chaos Gods. Their army charges forth with unparalleled aggression and ferocity, but this does leave them vulnerable in certain areas. If these vulnerabilities are exploited by your foes, then NORSCA will struggle. So in this guide, we'll go through the Norscan army and how it plays out on the battlefield. This is about how the army works in battle in Total War and not how to win their campaign. So let us march forth to NORSCA.
Their cowardly lords don't deserve their riches, so we shall kill them and take all that we see.
So what the hell are the main strengths and weaknesses of the Norscan army? Well, their first strength should come as no surprise, it's the monsters, of course. They've got a huge variety with single large monsters, monstrous infantry, cavalry-like monsters. All these are the true power of the Norscan army. However, fielding all these ferocious monsters is a trouble for your wallet, as the Norscan army is generally quite expensive. So it can be difficult to bring a large army with NORSCA, which runs the risk of you being enveloped by larger factions with more units like the Skaven or the Beastmen, etc. So that's always something to consider when constructing a Norscan army. And as your girlfriend likes to remind you, sometimes smaller is better. So despite you not being able to field a large force, the Norscan army has a ton of killing power, especially on the front line. This can give enemy infantry, and specifically front lines, a very difficult time holding back the Norscan assault. But one big area that NORSCA does fall short is in the range department. First of all, they have no artillery, and secondly, all their ranged units that they do have are very short ranged and aren't designed for taking on other missile units at all. So you may very often find yourself at a range disadvantage as NORSCA. This is somewhat slightly countered though, as the Norscan army is generally pretty quick, and it doesn't take them long to close the distance. They also have the frostbite debuff with a bunch of units that will slow the enemies down and potentially increase the disparity in speed between the two factions. So you'll be needing to hit them hard with the killing power and fast with the speed, because the Norsca army doesn't have great endurance. Much of the army lacks leadership and or armor, which means simply outlasting your opponent like the lizardmen or the dwarves or the high elves isn't really an option for NORSCA. You gotta kill and you gotta do it fast. So these are the main points about the Norscan army. Remember them well when playing as or against NORSCA. Now let's get into the roster so we can figure out the units. Your first lord of choice could be the Marauder Chieftain. On foot he'll do okay fighting in lightly armoured crowds, but will struggle against characters or heavily armoured units, as he's not armour piercing, doesn't have much armour or great melee defence. You can put him on a steed, a chariot or a mammoth, which I'd recommend as he's not fantastic on foot unless you really want to save money. Putting him on a chariot or mammoth can make him much more useful and formidable. If formidable is what you're after though, Wulfric the Wanderer is the man you need. He's got great stats all across the board, although he is lacking in his armour piercing. He's also a great duelist, so he can take on the other characters, although the lack of armour piercing may be a problem against heavier lords. However, his Hunter of Champions ability, which can be used against enemy characters, can even this out. It'll reduce their armour, melee defense and speed, making anyone a little bit more dealable with for Wulfric. There's also his Sea Fang ability, which is kinda like a magic wind spell, which can do damage and slow down your enemies. He also has a few mount options, including the War Mammoth, which will turn him into some armour piercing anti-infantry destroying, killing, murdering power. So if you want to murder enemy infantry or lords and heroes, go Wulfric. He's also not too expensive for a legendary lord. If you want something a little more sexy though, Throg is your guy. Another great melee lord, although with a different role to Wulfric, as he's armour piercing, anti-large and has frostbite, which makes him great at taking on enemy large lords and heroes. He can help deal with cavalry, monstrous infantry, anything that's large basically. He can also use that frostbite to keep them from running away too easily. So a better choice if you're expecting lots of large enemies to deal with. He can also be put on a steed mount. I am of course joking, that would look absolutely ridiculous. As he's a troll, he also has regeneration, which is nice, and can vomit on everyone if you're into that sort of thing, but is the most expensive lord of the bunch. For your heroes, you could have a Shaman Sorcerer of Death, of Fire, or of Metal, whichever lore book you prefer. They are your typical squishy wizard, probably want to put them on a horse to keep them safe. Or if you want them to do a bit more work, stick them on a chariot. You can of course use whichever one fits your build the best. Skinwolf Werekin. I'm going to go ahead and liken him to the Gorbel, as he has similar stats and the same kind of role. He's armor piercing, he's anti-large, he can dish out plenty of damage. He's also got regeneration and a physical resistance, so he can take a bit of punishment himself. Going to be great at taking down those large units, especially lords or heroes on mounts. Or, as he has an ability called Ruinous Flesh, which can make your nearby units a little bit tougher, he could be useful travelling with a pack of skin wolves and playing more of a supportive role. And your last hero choice is the Fimir Bale Fiends. There's one of Shadows and one of the Fire lore books. So the magic is useful in its own right, but they actually make great support units as they have armor sundering. So if you mix them in with your front line, they can help bring any heavily armored units down to size a little bit. They've also got magical attacks and armor piercing themselves, so they'll be able to get a bit of damage done. A great way to combine magic and a more practical use in melee and support. Marauders. The closest thing you have to an expendable infantry. They could be a great distraction and they'll do a little bit of damage if they get into melee, but they're not going to last too long because of their lack of armor and leadership. Very much your typical low tier infantry. Not really reliable as a front line unless you bring a lot of them, but could be useful for absorbing charges or going for suicide flanking attacks, but don't expect them to win the battle for you. And a similar deal with the Marauder Spearmen. Not going to be fantastic, but they are your cheapest anti-large unit and will fill the role of protecting your flanks well enough. Your typical cheap spear unit really, but with their low armor, missiles can be a big problem as they have no shield. So do be careful of those missiles because they will take these boys out very quickly. Another low tier unit in Great Weapon Marauders. These boys are a little more useful though as they are armor piercing, so it's always nice to have a cheap armor piercing option that you could bring a fair few of. They could do well mixed in with non-armor piercing units, or just to charge in by themselves and do as much armor piercing damage as they can. Again, a lack of armor and leadership means they have questionable staying power, but again, much like the normal Marauders, if you bring a lot of them, they can be a bit more of a problem for your enemy. And then for a Regiment of Renown version of the Marauders, the Icehorn Marauders are a little bit more formidable than their regular counterpart. They have better staying power with higher melee defense and leadership, and a little bit of extra damage as well. They also don't get tired and are immune to psychology. These two things will make them a little bit more useful in the later game. When everyone else is exhausted and on low leadership, these boys can stay in the fight that little bit longer and help chase down any routing units perhaps. And to one of my personal favourite units, Marauder Berserkers are the first infantry that come with a real purpose. They've got great weapon strength with a bonus versus infantry, nice melee attack, great leadership, a bit of a charge bonus, frenzy, the berserk trait that we'll talk about later on, so much killing power in this unit they will destroy other infantry. Even ones with quite a lot of armor when they don't have armor piercing. The longer they fight, the stronger they get as well. So if you can keep them alive and keep them safe and get them to a fight without being hammered by missiles and cav charges because of that low armor and low melee defense, they could take a lot of damage very quickly. A very powerful frontline unit, or with their nifty foot speed, they can play the role of flanker as well. So with all the previous units being pretty fragile overall, we need something with a bit more staying power. This is where Marauder Champions come in. High armor, good leadership, good melee defense, all the traits of a good holding unit, and they've still got the stats to dish out a bit of damage. However, they are pretty expensive, so maybe not plausible as a full front line 4 or 5 units might cost far too much, but 2 or 3 maybe mixed in with some lesser Marauders could be a good way to go and give you that extra holding power for some hammer and anvil maybe. Now if the regular Berserkers aren't mental enough for you, then the Regiment of Renown version, the Brutes of the Hound, may bring the extra death to your foes that you do require. They have slightly better attack and melee defense, and most notably are unbreakable, which for a unit like this is very powerful because they'll keep fighting and keep doing damage till the bitter end of them, which can make them a great holding unit of a certain position, and they cause fear so can hopefully scare the enemy off that little bit sooner. Again, a dangerous damage dealer on the front line, or a nasty flanker. If you need to bring more armor piercing to the table, then Marauder Champions with great weapons are your elite choice. Similar to regular Marauder Champions of course, just with less holding power now and more damage output, so lower melee defense, no shield, but armor piercing to make up for it. A good choice against heavily armoured factions who generally have smaller armies like the Chaos or the Lizardmen, but again their price tag makes it difficult to field a lot of them, so it could be a good unit to mix in with a front line rather than having a full front line of them. More Marauders now, this time in the form of Hunters with Javelins. A short range missile attack which is very powerful and anti-large. So obviously great for taking down monsters and cavalry, but because of that short range they do need to be quite close to their target, which is risky for them given their lack of armor and leadership. So maybe coupling them up with some spearmen who can protect them while they absolutely hammer the enemy large units with javelins could be a good combo. And their melee stats aren't completely terrible, but they're probably only really going to be able to damage other missile units. And then there's another kind of marauder hunters, this time with throwing axes, which are armor piercing and have shield breaker, so they'll reduce the missile parry chance of shielded units. So very useful for getting extra damage in on said units. It is a very short range attack though, so they do need to be pretty close, and while their melee stats are slightly better than the previous version as they have more melee attack, they're still not going to survive great. Maybe best off supporting javelins against heavily armoured shielded cavalry or shielded monsters. So to the cavalry, which is of course a lacking department for NORSCA. They actually have the same options as the Chaos, so first up we've got Marauder Horsemen, who are an okay harassing unit. They can do a bit of damage to unarmoured units, but ultimately aren't going to do a great deal unless maybe you can keep them alive for the entire battle, which isn't easy given their lack of armour and crappy melee skills. They can maybe chase down some skirmishers, but are best just trying to be a decent distraction. And then you've got basically the same unit again, just this time with armor piercing throwing axes, which does make them a fair bit more useful as they can do more damage. Again, they can be a nice harassing distraction, but they could rack up a bit of damage on those heavily armoured elite units to wear them down a bit. And then you've got Marauder Horse Masters, who are all round just better than the previous two. They have some armour, they've got better melee stats, they can do more damage, so this unit can be a little bit better. Still going to be a great harassing unit, maybe great for just weakening a particular powerful unit like Sword Masters, weaken them before they get into the melee fight with your troops. It can just help out and give them a bit more cause than just running around trying to distract things. As they are a bit better in melee, they can be a little bit more ideal for taking down missiles. And now we have a couple chariots, beginning with the Marauder Chariot, which is very much your basic chariot unit. Anti-infantry, nice charge bonus, good bit of armour. Has pretty terrible melee attack, so you'll need that charge bonus to boost it up and give it that damaging power. So charge it in, leave it there for a few seconds and then pull it away before you end up with 22 melee attack and are doing basically no damage again. Great harassing typical chariot unit. If you want something a bit more snazzy, then the Marauder Ice Wolves Chariot is just that. Snazzy. It's basically the same as the previous unit, good typical all-round chariot unit, but it now has Frostbite, which is going to slow down your enemies, and a powerful armor-piercing missile attack. So it makes it a much better harassing unit. You can keep it outside of combat until you see a good opportunity to swoop in, nail a tasty charge on someone, and then get away, all the while still doing damage with that missile attack. So a better harassing chariot. It also causes fear, which is a nice touch, could be a great one for finishing off units that are about to rout. So if you can manage the extra micro, an Ice Wolf Chariot could be very deadly. Now for the big bad monsters. Although the first one not being that big, Norscan Warhounds are your typical Warhound unit. Very quick and fantastic for running down missiles and artillery, and not a lot else. They can be a harassing unit quite well if you keep them around the back of an enemy army. They're always going to be keeping their eye on the Warhounds because they can be very dangerous, especially at running down routed units as well. If you've gotten rid of some Chosen, let's say, you've routed them, they've still got a few men left though, they may come back and cause problems. The Warhounds can just get on them and chew them down and just prevent them from coming back to the fight. So there are a couple of ways for Warhounds to be useful. If you want a slightly better version of this, Norscan Ice Wolves have got you covered. They've got a few slightly improved stats over the Warhounds, they cause fear, and they have Frostbite. So those two things could be useful, helping other units out and supporting them with the Frostbite to slow the enemy down, the fear to hopefully make them rout a little bit quicker. Or they could do the same job as the Warhounds and just get after missiles and artillery. They'll be able to do it a little bit more effectively as they do more damage and have the Frostbite. They could even drop in a quick bit of hammer and anvil to drop that fear and attacked in the rear penalty. And for a Regiment of Renown version of the Norscan Warhounds, the Beasts of Tashnar are very similar with slightly improved stats, but now they are anti-large and have Vanguard deployment. So they've got the option to be a little bit more sneaky. Given that they're still quite squishy though, they're not going to do great fighting monsters or heavy cavalry like you might think because they're anti-large. I'd say mixing them in with something like Skinwall so they can help them out, and it'll help them avoid damage from whatever they're fighting. So if Skinwalls were fighting some heavy cavalry, these boys could flank round super quick, get in the back of them, just surround that unit and help those Skinwolves out. Or they could chase down some lighter cavalry, which they could do a bit more damage to, so they can make use of that anti-large bonus. Onto our good old Norscan Trolls, who are very much your typical troll unit. Good for their high weapon strength and armor piercing damage, a good one to add into a front line if you're lacking armor piercing up there. Or as they're pretty quick on their feet, they can be a good flanking unit. They also have that fear, so they can flank round, attack an enemy in the back, inflict the attack in the rear penalty and the fear, hopefully rout units a little bit quicker. They do have low armor and low leadership though, so don't expect them to stick around too long. That quick routing though is a blessing in disguise, as it does give them time to regenerate their health. Trolls are great damage dealers, just not the most reliable. If you prefer your trolls straight out of the fridge however, I've got you some NORSCA ice trolls. Very much the same deal as the normal trolls, they can just do a little bit more damage and they've got the frostbite. But ultimately, they're going to be used in the same way as regular trolls. Get them in the front line for that armor piercing, get them flanking round because they're pretty quick. So maybe better against faster factions to slow them down a bit. Given that they're extremely icy as well, they also have an additional 20% weakness to fire, which I assume is on top of their regeneration weakness, which would give them a 45% weakness to fire. I assume it stacks, but I'm not 100% sure. On to another one of my personal favourite units. Skin wolves are the closest thing you have to a cavalry. High weapon strength with a bonus versus large means they're going to be great for, of course, taking down the large units, perhaps maybe with a focus on cavalry. They don't have much armor, leadership or melee defense, so they're not the toughest unit in the world, but that routing that will inevitably happen with them is useful because it'll give them time to regenerate their health. They also have a 20% physical resistance, fear and frenzy. Given their lack of armor, missiles can be a problem for them, so probably going to be the better choice against lesser missile heavy factions. A powerful unit for protecting your flanks from cavalry or pushing on large units. And in the same vein, armoured skin wolves are what you might expect. They're a little bit slower than normal skin wolves, but of course they have that armour which is going to protect them from those missiles, which will be good against those missile heavy factions, and just generally protect them better overall, giving them better survivability, which isn't a word as I meant to say survivability. I should also mention that both these units aren't really armour piercing despite their massive claws, so you may want to pick your targets wisely and avoid the heavily armoured ones unless you can get a buff on them or get them some armour piercing support, because the damage they take may not be worth it for the damage they do. If you are expecting heavily armoured large units though, the Maws of Savagery are armoured skin wolves that will solve that problem. They have improved stats over the regular version and of course the armor piercing damage, not to mention their vanguard deployment as well, which can give them some sneaky ambush opportunities. They can take on some of the top tier cavalries and beat them, or at least beat them into uselessness, albeit at a very expensive cost. On to the first of our Fimir warriors, monstrous infantry that are very pricey, but you do get a lot for them. A ton of armor piercing weapon strength with magical attacks and armor sundering, which is awesome. A great deal of armor, they're pretty fast as well, they've just got a lot going on for them. They are quite a versatile unit. Because they're so fast, they can be a flanking unit. They can go in on the front line and support with that armor sundering to help out any other frontline units like berserkers who don't have armor piercing. So a good choice against those heavily armored factions, potentially. And while the regular Fimir warriors are the destroyers of infantry, Fimir warriors with great weapons are the destroyers of large. They're armor piercing with a bonus versus large, still got the armor sundering and the magical attacks and the great armor and the speed, so a dangerous unit that can deal with your large enemies. Whether that be a heavily armoured elite cavalry like Grail Knights or a heavily armoured monster like a Bastillodon, they will give them an absolute hammering, pun completely intended. Bring these fellas if you expect elite large. If you're more of the shifty persuasion and like to try and trick your enemies, then Mist Stalkers are a treat for you. They're the same old Fimir warriors with a few improved stats, but they now have Vanguard deployment and Stalk, so you can potentially position them out the way somewhere and sneak them up on the enemy for a nasty little surprise. They also cause terror, so that flanker role has got their name written all over it. Now if air superiority is more your thing, then you could bring along a Feral Manticore. Very much the same as your usual Feral Manticore, great for pestering skirmishers and missiles. He's got terror, so he can swoop down and inflict a little bit of terror on some frontline units when they're low on leadership, perhaps. They don't survive terribly well in prolonged combat, so try not to leave them in combat too long, charge them around like a flying chariot sort of thing, that's how they tend to work best. If you're really gunning for air superiority, you'll probably want to bring yourself a Frostworm. It's a dragon, of course, going to be great at flying around and absolutely terrorizing the battlefield, lots of armor piercing damage, magical attacks, frostbite, and of course a very powerful breath attack. A great late game unit that can be very difficult to stop without the right tools. Those tools of course being missiles generally, or even artillery that can focus it down. Do your best to avoid those and don't keep it in prolonged melee combat too long, and it will serve you very well. If you're looking for land superiority, why not give your local Norscan giant a call? Very much your typical giant, tons of armor piercing weapon strength that can absolutely ruin elite heavily armoured infantry, but of course he is a big slow lumbering target that missiles and artillery will absolutely light up. If you can get rid of those things and control the enemy anti-large units, he can wreak absolute havoc. A better choice perhaps against factions that lack the missiles or capabilities to effectively deal with large units. And finally, we come to the most recognisable part of the Norscan army, the mammoths. Beginning with our feral mammoth. A ton of anti-infantry killing power, which is armor piercing, a massive charge bonus which you'll want to make use of, so charge him into a battle, let him fight for maybe 5 or 10 seconds and then pull him away and charge him into a different unit so he keeps getting his charge bonus and keeps doing tons of damage. He lacks armor and melee defense, so prolonged combat isn't going to do him much good. Missiles are a big problem for him as well, so maybe a better choice against those factions without strong missiles. He's got terror, which makes him better for bouncing around as well, although he does run the risk of becoming feral if he takes too much damage and you'll lose control of him. If you're in the market for a higher quality mammoth, then why not pick yourself up a war mammoth? He can output the same great melee damage that the feral mammoth can, and is now better protected with some armor. There's also a few dudes on his back slinging missiles around, providing that constant damage to any enemies around. Those missiles are also anti-large, so a constant damage powerhouse. Keep him travelling around like a chariot, charge him in, pull him away, those missiles will keep doing damage. A very dangerous unit that can terrorise the battlefield, especially in the late game, if you can look after him. And then you've got more of a supporting mammoth in the War Mammoth War Shrine. It has the same great damaging stats, but doesn't have any missiles anymore, but does have a few nice abilities. One that will give 10 leadership to all nearby units, very useful on the front line, so it could be more of a frontline mammoth as such, and an ability which it can cast on a friendly unit to make it unbreakable and imbue them with fire damage. So like I say, both abilities great for support, so this could be a good one to keep up on the front line rather than the other two mammoths that are more flanking mammoths, maybe charging them around like chariots. This one may be better off sticking by the front line. Still don't want to leave it in prolonged combat too much because it doesn't have fantastic melee defense, but that extra 10 leadership to nearby units could be a game changer. And lastly, Soul Crusher. A war mammoth with a few improved stats and those anti-large missile attacks, but now it has the Strider ability, so it won't be slowed down by hills or any other type of terrain, and it can pop a 44% damage resistance buff, making it incredibly tough. So this one could be more use against those missile heavy factions that are going to try and gun it down. It can pop its damage resistance buff and charge through that front line, disrupt those missiles, stop them from firing, while the rest of the army moves up and doesn't take the damage from those missiles. In theory, anyway, that's just how that ability could be useful in a battle situation. But there's a mammoth for every occasion, so pick the one that fits your army best. So now that we know the units, let's look at how we can strategically employ them for NORSCA. First off, it's no secret that they are a rush army who need to be fast and aggressive. It's nearly impossible for them to play defensive as they have no artillery and their missiles can't trade with enemy missiles. NORSCA don't have the armour or leadership to tank out artillery and missile fire, so they need to get all up in the enemy's face and fast. It isn't always easy, but that's how Norscans roll. Which brings us to our next point, that NORSCA has a ton of killing power in its army, most notably on the front line. They can dish out massive amounts of damage very quickly if the units are applied well. Marauder Berserkers, Fimir Warriors, Trolls, Mammoths, you can have these units working together to best support each other. For example, Marauder Berserkers can do a ton of damage to infantry, but heavy armour could be a problem for them. So some armour piercing Fimir Warriors with their armour sundering as well can make life a little bit easier for the Berserkers. Not to mention Trolls that are armour piercing, they could help out. So you can combine these units to put a ton of killing power in one specific spot on the enemy front line and you'll break it very quickly, at least that's the plan, and then you can flank round on the rest of that front line for some tasty envelopment. So you can try out different concoctions of all your different infantry and monsters. Even a cheaper unit like Marauders could be an acceptable front line if they're backed by some Ice Trolls. The Marauders can absorb damage and protect the Trolls, while the Trolls dish out the damage. If you're fearing a bunch of dangerous large units, you could bring a front line of Marauder Spearmen backed by the anti-large Fimir Warriors. Or if you want to bring the absolute pain to the enemy front line, you could bring Berserkers with the normal Fimir Warriors. They can help out with their armor piercing and armor sundering, and then the Mammoth can do tons of armor piercing damage as well and boost the leadership of all those nearby units. So mix and match and try out different combinations to see what you can best use to effectively destroy your enemies. It's not essential to combine units for a front line, but you can make some powerful combos. A passive ability to know about for NORSCA infantry as well is their Rage or Berserk abilities. Most units have Rage, with a few having Berserk. Basically, the longer you stay in combat with your infantry, the more powerful they become. So when you engage an enemy, you enter stage 1, and then after so many seconds you enter stage 2, etc. Each new stage brings new buffs for the unit, from physical resistance, melee attack, leadership, and rampage for the Berserk units. So keeping them in combat for this length of time is going to be helpful for getting those extra buffs, but after those buffs expire, they will be back to no buff, so you may want to try and pull them out if possible, and get them in again so they can get that buff all over again. A great buff that will aid NORSCA in doing their damage in a short space of time. But despite the power your frontline may be able to harness, they all have one glaring weakness. Missiles and artillery can wreck them before they even get to the fight. This is where your disrupting and harassing units come into play. Warhounds, chariots, missile cav, mammoths, manticores, all these things are great potential harassing units that can distract or disrupt any missiles or artillery and prevent them from firing on your precious front line. Some of these units may end up as a sacrifice for the greater good of your front line, but it really depends where you've put your money. If you've gone for a quite expensive front line like a whole bunch of berserkers, like I have here, they're very vulnerable as they have no armor and no shields, so missiles and artillery will absolutely destroy them. I've got to try and stop them from firing for as long as possible to keep my berserkers safe. So, on the left, I've got quite a hefty flanking party. You probably normally wouldn't need to bring this much, but I've got a bit of everything. I've got some warhounds, I've got a mammoth, I've got a manticore, I've got a chariot, I've got another chariot somewhere else, so there's tons of disrupting power coming along here. And you can see these missiles are being chased off, so they're now not firing at any of my vulnerable units. We're going to keep them on the move. This is a very common tactic. A fair few factions have to play this way because they don't have the armor or the leadership to withstand this missile punishment. So we've got to try and tie them up as much as possible, keep them from doing damage to any of our precious vulnerable units. So these units are coming in. They're not always going to end up in the best matchups, but like I said, they can kind of be sacrifices sometimes for the front line, because if your front line is designed to do all the killing for you and it's got all that killing power in it, you're going to need to protect it. So these units may need to be sacrificed for that. Of course, you still want to try and get the best matchups with them and get the most killing done as possible with them, but if you're relying on your front line to win the game for you, you've got to protect it. Now, just for a side note quickly, a few things I found about mammoths. They suffer from the same problem as a lot of high mass units that can get stuck on one single line of infantry. Somehow, those tiny bodies are holding back that massive one. As the mammoth is quite slow in its animations, this can be a real problem, meaning it's hard to use them in a chariot or cycle charging way, so it's difficult to get the most out of their mighty charge bonus. Another thing I've noticed is that sometimes they just simply ignore orders and just keep on attacking. When you charge them in like so, cool, I'm going to tell it to come out now, and it's going to turn the other way. It's just going to completely ignore what I've told it to. Click it again, it's still going off on its attack. Click it over here to try and get it out. No, still just attacking. Okay, good. Just completely ignore my orders. This sort of thing is going to mean a lot of micromanagement attention for your mammoth, which of course can be bad news for the rest of your army if you're having to put so much attention on one unit. Personally, I'd only ever bring one mammoth for this reason, because they're just simply too micro-intensive. You could try leaving them in combat a bit more if they've got a good matchup, so that there's less micro to worry about. So just beware all that comes with the mammoths. Now, one area of the NORSCA army that is lacking is their cavalry department. They have no traditional heavy shock cavalry, so we need something to fill those cav roles. This is where skinwolves come into play, as they're the closest thing we have to a shock type cavalry. But hammer and anvil isn't really their goal. They're going to be great at taking down enemy cavalry, as they have the anti-large bonus. So if you're needing a mobile unit to protect your flanks, then skinwolves are going to be the best choice. I'd recommend the armoured version if possible, because the unarmoured version is a little bit fragile. The Maws of Savagery are going to be your best choice, as they can defeat even some of the most elite anti-large cavs. If hammer and anvil is more on your agenda, then I find that trolls are actually the best for this, as they're anti-infantry and have armour piercing and are quite quick, they can do this job pretty well. And because they cause fear, that'll stack with the attacked in the rear penalty, meaning they can deliver a pretty big hit to the enemy's leadership. The same is true of Fimir warriors, allowing you to get some potentially really nice surrounds on your enemies. So while you don't have any traditional heavy cav, understand that you can create the same effect with different units. And as I say, skinwolves are great for that cav destroying role, as they are anti-large. And speaking of anti-large, this is another quite strong place for NORSCA. They've got a good amount of anti-large units with a good variety of different capabilities. You've got ranged ones, fast ones, heavy ones with armor piercing, cheap ones, expensive ones, heroes. There's a strong variety, which means NORSCA are pretty well set in the anti-large department. Your marauder hunters with javelins are always a good go-to unit, as large units are generally big targets which are easy to hit. Nice for all those powerful javelins which are anti-large. And there's your marauder spearmen, who are not the best unit in the world of course, but they will do a fair amount of damage even to elite units. Even though they won't beat them, they can still damage them a lot. They may be quite expensive for what you're paying, but they're the only infantry anti-large choice you have. So if you're bringing the cheaper anti-large options, the spearmen and the hunters, you can do well to combine their powers, get the spearmen to tie things up and get the javelins to absolutely hammer them. I've got the anti-large Fimir warriors in this fight as well, but they're a pretty strong individual unit who can take things down by them damn selves. But still, any combination is going to be powerful, so NORSCA need not fear the large. And now speaking of fear, making people feel it is something that NORSCA can do pretty well, as pretty much all of their monsters cause fear. And this is a powerful and necessary tool for NORSCA, as they have low leadership themselves. They can help themselves out by lowering the enemy's leadership with fear. This will help you rout the enemy that little bit sooner, and as NORSCA infantry is generally a bit faster than most other infantry, they can keep up and keep killing them while they're routed, allowing for a ton of extra damage while they run away. Not to mention the terror ability that a lot of the bigger monsters have. They can charge around routing any of those units low on leadership, allowing your infantry to give chase and cut them down a little bit as they flee. So creating builds that utilize fear and terror is definitely a powerful tactic for NORSCA. The addition of trolls or Fimir warriors across your front line, for example, can help spread that fear and get your front line breaking through that little bit quicker. Now, just for a couple of quick problems for NORSCA, as I've mentioned many times, missiles are one of the biggest dangers for NORSCA. Not only can they gun down your unarmoured infantry, but they could make short work of your large units with a bit of focus fire as well, so you have to be very careful and do your best to get rid of missile units, or disrupt them at least, before sending in your scantily clad marauders. The same is true of artillery that can blast your poor mammoths in the face. You got to find a way to disrupt it and protect these important units. This can be done by terrain, or your harassing units, or magic, or by simply rushing up on the enemy quick before he has time to think. So just understand that ranged attacks pose a bigger threat to NORSCA than they do to most other factions, so you need to learn to be able to deal with that. And the last thing you may need to learn to deal with is potential envelopment. NORSCA is generally quite an expensive army overall, which of course means your armies are going to be smaller, as we've mentioned. Take this into consideration when facing factions that can field large armies like the Greenskins, Beastmen, Skaven, as I say about 10 million times in all my videos, lest you find yourself surrounded, flanked, and just simply enveloped. Your low leadership will not survive well when flanked, because those attacked in the rear penalties will add up, and you'll be gone before you know it. So these are two of the biggest dangers that NORSCA face. Learn to be very aware of them. So these are the main tactical points to think about when playing as NORSCA, in my humble opinion. A very fast, aggressive and powerful faction, very dangerous in the short term. Whether you win or lose with them is going to be determined in the first few minutes of the battle really. If you apply things well, protect them from damage, you'll be able to utilize your power. But if you get beaten up early, longevity and endurance is going to be your problem. Now let's take a gander at a few army compositions and game plans with a few NORSCA builds. So for my first composition, we're going for a range rush build. This is one for if you're facing an enemy with lots of missile units and you're expecting to just get gunned down, you could counter it with this build. So if you suspect a lot of missiles are going to be coming your way, this army has 5 or 6 units, we can counter that by bringing too many things for the enemy to shoot at. So we've got lots of cheap infantry, a front line of marauders who have their shields to help save them from all those missiles a little bit. Then we've got some spearmen just in case of anti-large, they're of course at the edges. And then I've got a big flanking party of warhounds, some skin wolves and a manticore that can bring a heavy wide flanking attack that will be very difficult for the enemy to stop. Those warhounds of course very quick, they can get after the missiles, after the artillery, and absolutely just overwhelm the enemy with numbers in a sort of greenskins or beastmen or Skaven fashion. You can see these Chaos Marauders getting quite hammered by missiles, losing a lot of life, but they're still pushing forward. They've got their shield to protect them from some of those missiles and keep them in the game, at least long enough to just tie up some of that front line and allow all this flanking party to come round and ruin all these missile units. And this is against the AI, by the way, so not always the most intelligent of opponents. But if you're facing a faction with a lot of missiles, any of the Elven factions pretty much, the Empire, Bretonia, all these strong missile factions, this build could work a treat to overrun them. Your Spearmen and Skinwolves can get after the large of course, or you could have your Skinwolves absolutely blitz some infantry. Your Skinwolves can proceed to munch down on any nearby archers, and there's also 2 units of Berserkers in the army for any extra killing power that you may need. Overall, a fun little build to swarm your enemy and overrun them with sheer numbers and aggression. It won't work that great if you're facing a lot of heavy armor though, as the army generally lacks armor piercing. So if you expect a lot of missiles, range rush. Onto Ninja Hun's build, which is a little more tried and tested in the online world, and in a true Ninja Hun fashion is pretty much a long line of death. The main part of the front line is all Berserkers, with the Brutes of the Hound in the middle of them, so plenty of killing power there. He's got the Maws of Savagery and some Skinwolves for any anti-large needs, or to help bolster that front line for a little bit. He's got Wolfric on a mammoth and a feral mammoth for all your mammoth killing powers, and then a metal sorcerer and some warhounds as well. The warhounds of course going to try and get after any missiles or artillery. This hammer of the witch is particularly dangerous. He's going to try and tie it up here to stop it firing on his mammoths, as it's already done a fair bit of damage to Wolfric, so I've got to try and protect those large units from the range. The front line's going to get engaged. The berserkers going to be doing most of the killing for you, against lighter factions of course, because those berserkers don't have the armor piercing. And in this particular battle, the enemy army is literally twice the size of Ninja Huns, so he's going to have to use all his units well. He's got his mammoths where he's going to try and spread the terror as much as possible, going to try and keep them apart so you can get as much terror across the battlefield as possible. You can see his front line here breaking through some of these units. Those flagellants have been destroyed, halberds destroyed, so he's broken through. He can get after the missile units. Going to try and use his metal sorcerer with final transmutation to beat down those lords or any groups of enemies. Another important tool in this build is Wolfric's item, which gives him 75% extra weapon damage, which makes him pretty damn brutal. So you want to pop that when you engage any important units. Then it's just a case of wearing down the enemy with your killing power as quickly as possible. The two mammoths, like I said, can spread the terror around. They can try to help control all the missiles and artillery that may be trying to get them dead. If you find there's some heavy armor around, you're going to need to use those mammoths to help out the infantry, because the berserkers may struggle against them without the armor piercing. But if you can wield this build effectively, you can defeat an army even twice your size. So give it a bash and see if it works for you. Now the last build I have is an anti-large one. Great if you're facing factions which possess lots of powerful monsters, as pretty much all of our units are anti-large. We've got a spearman front line in case any monsters charge straight at us, but it's not going to be the best holding line in the world due to their lack of armor. We've got lots of anti-large missiles on both of our wings to cover against any cheeky flanking attacks. Also to the same end, I've got the Maws of Savagery with a Werekin, and a couple of the anti-large Fimir warriors who can go where they're needed. The front line of spearmen is likely to be engaged by infantry that will beat the crap out of it. You can try and support them with any spare units on the front line, but if you can beat the crap out of the flanking units and get behind the enemy, it's going to make life a lot easier to help your front line. This right side is a big cluster of large units. My Maws of Savagery and Werekin in there, giving them hell. Got a lot of missiles coming in as well. Again, this is against the AI. Really, the AI should be getting after my missiles, but as most people only play campaign, this is likely the type of stuff you'll be facing anyway. This spear front line has been holding pretty well against the lizard men here, even though there's some Saurus warriors in there. I've now had time to get round on a flanking attack though, get some of these javelins in the back, get the Fimir warriors in the back. That'll help that side of the line get the enemies done quick. Over on the left, we've routed some of these larger units with all the missiles and the Maws of Savagery. They've taken a fair pounding themselves, but they have done a lot of damage to Krokgar there and that Revivification Crystal Bastillodon. And eventually, if your front line can hold on long enough for you to get that flanking attack in, you should be able to rout the enemy frontline units relatively quickly. As you've got all the best tools for taking care of any flanking units, monsters and cavalry mainly, you should be able to win those fights fairly quickly and get round to that front line to help them out. So going to work well against armies with a lot of large units, the lizard men, the vampires, even Bretonia with all their cavalry. Although missiles could be a particular danger to this army, as those spearmen don't have any shields, so they may get cut down by long range missiles. A fun build to play if you do see a lot of large units coming your way, as you will be well equipped to deal with them. It can make short work of any armies that are relying on their heavy large units. So there you go. A guide to the Norscan army and how to use them on the battlefield. I hope you found this useful and it will help you wield the Northmen with a little bit more ferocity than you did before perhaps. I thank you for watching, I hope you've enjoyed this. See you in the future.